So let's talk about what the null value is. Now, a null value has been called the billion-dollar mistake in the past, and this is because it has caused so many errors and such a huge amount of problems in software development that the creator, let's say, of the first programming language that accepts null values has said that that was one of the biggest mistakes that he made to put in the capability of having null values. Okay, so null values are quite a big issue in software development languages, and that is because the program cannot perform any action on a null value, because it's like, think about a variable that hasn't been allocated any space in memory, right? So that variable doesn't really exist. And if you try to perform an action on something that doesn't exist, you cannot do that. So a program that tries to do that will crash, okay? And that leads to a very bad user experience that can lead to loss of data, and so on and so forth. So that is a huge problem. Null value simply means that there's no value present, okay? It doesn't mean that it's empty, because you can have, like, for instance, an empty string that's still a value for that string. It kind of means that the variable does not have a place, does not really exist. You kind of just declare it, but it's not actually allocated anywhere. So you can't perform any kind of operation on it. If you do try to use a variable with a null value, your program will crash and it will put out a null pointer exception. Okay, so that means that the execution will stop. Whatever point you're on, that will be the end of your program. As a user, you will see your program just disappear, and you might lose data that has not been saved to kind of a permanent storage. Okay, so it's quite a big deal. So think about, I don't know, a banking program that crashes in the middle of a transaction, right? No matter how much money you have in that transaction, you would have a big problem, because you don't know what happened to that money, right? So that is a big problem. So Kotlin provides some guarantees to guard against null values, and we will see what those guarantees are. So this is one of the main selling points of Kotlin, is that it does not allow, unless it's improperly used, it does not allow for null values to be accessed. Okay, so you cannot generate a null pointer exception unless you specifically try to do that. And we will see how you can try to do that, not for the purpose of actually introducing errors in our programs, but for the purpose of guarding against those situations where you might inadvertently avoid Kotlin's guarantees and actually generate an exception. Right, so the way Kotlin avoids null values is that it differentiates between variables that can be null and those that cannot be null. Okay, so you have two types of variables. You have the nullable and the non-nullable variables, and we do that using the question mark operator. Okay, so here is an example. We have a variable, her name, of type string, whatever the name you want to give. And then we have another variable, his name. This time we put a question mark after the type of variable, and we give that variable the value null. Okay, so there is a strong difference between the variables that cannot be null. So this one cannot be null because it has a value right from the moment that it is created, and the ones that can be null. And at this point, this variable can be null because we put a question mark after the type, and is in fact null because we have provided the value null here. So if a variable cannot be null, it must be given a value. Okay, so this is the example, the first example here. And if a variable can be null, you can still give it a value that is optional. But if you do not provide a value, you must provide the value null. Okay, so let's go ahead in our IDE and try this code ourselves. So we can say val her name is of type string, and has the value Lily, okay? And then we have the value his name of type string, but this time it is optional. So here we might choose not to give it a value, but we still need to provide the value null. So let's say we do not want to pass this null value to our variable. So we can simply say string that is nullable. But if we try to, for instance, use her name to print out, that is fine. But if we want to print line his name, we would get a compilation error because the system tells us before we use this, the variable must be initialized. So that means we need to pass it the value null here. Okay, so it's important that before you use the variable, you initialize it, either giving it an actual value or giving it the null value. It has to have something, right? So there we go. You must provide the value null. I should have probably put here if you want to use it. If you just want to declare it, that's fine. You can declare it without a value. But if you want to use it, even if it's null, you have to provide some value for it. So here you have his name of type string without a value. And if we try to print line, we will get a compilation error. All right, so the null keyword is used to assign the value null to a nullable variable. Okay, so we cannot assign the value null to a variable that is not nullable, that hasn't been defined using the question mark. So I give you here an example. Var cat name of type string that can be null is nullable. I give it a whatever name you like. I have a cat name equals null, and that is okay because this variable is nullable, has a question mark. Okay, so this is allowed. However, if I have a variable dog name of type string that is not nullable, so I haven't provided a question mark here, if I try to assign the value null to it, then I get a compilation error because Kotlin knows that this variable cannot be null. Okay, it can never be null, so you cannot assign the value null to it. So we can go ahead and try that out in our code. I'm going to have a val cat name of type string that is null. I give it a name. What name did I give it? Chonkers. Okay, so I give it the name Chonkers. Then I can say cat name equals null when, sorry, that's just because I need to declare a var instead of a val. I can declare a value null because this is nullable. Okay, but if I have a var dog name of type string without the question mark is fluffy, then I can have dog name equals null. That will give me a compilation error. So I cannot even run this program because I have a null value here. So even the system recognizes that null cannot be a value of a non-null type string. Okay, so Kotlin will guard against this. It knows that this variable cannot be null, so it doesn't allow us to give it the value null. So I'm just going to comment this out. Right, so there we go. That is the null variable. In the next video, we're going to look at how we can actually access variables that might be null. Okay, so there are some variables that might be null that may have a value that we would want, and we should be able to access that, and we will see how we can access that in a safe way without running the risk of generating null pointer exceptions. So in this video, we're going to talk about null-safe calls or null operators. So null operators are basically operators that we can use, and sometimes we have to use on null values or on variables that can be null. So we are already familiar with the nullable operator. This is basically the operator that tells the system that a variable of a certain type can be null. Okay, so here we have the example. We have cat name is of type string that can be null, and we give it a value. Okay, so here I've put two kind of different types of variables. On the left side, we have variables that can be null, on the right side, we have variables that cannot be null. Okay, so here we give it a value and we don't supply the string question mark. So we don't say that this variable can be null. So therefore, on the left side, we can associate the value null to our variable because our variable is declared as nullable. Okay, we have the nullable operator. But on the right-hand side, we cannot give this variable the value null because we have a variable that cannot be null. I just realized now that instead of val, we should have var here so that we are able to change the value of the variable. But apart from that, everything is correct. So we cannot assign the value null here. We get a compilation error. All right, so I just paused the video to update my slides here because I want everything to be correct. So we do have a var. We can change the value, but we cannot assign null to it because we get a compilation error. But on the left side, everything is okay because we can assign null values to our variables. So let's go ahead and try that in our editor. I'm going to say var cat name is of type string that can be null. So I'm using the nullable operator. And I'm going to give it a name. It doesn't really matter what the name is. And then here I'm going to try to do cat name equals null. So that we can see that everything is fine now. We can assign the value null here to our variable. If we miss this nullable operator, we get a compilation error. Null cannot be a value of a non-null type string. So we have a variable type string that is non-null because we haven't declared it here. And the IDE is telling us, no, you cannot assign a null to this kind of variable. Okay, so that is very important because Kotlin makes a distinction between variables that can be null and variables that cannot be null, because we can perform certain operations on variables that can be null, and we can perform other operations on variables that cannot be null, just to kind of make sure that we don't ask something of a null variable that will lead to an exception. All right, so back to our slides. We have the nullable operator. And this nullable operator is basically an operator that we can use when we are dealing with nullable variables. Okay, so here's an example. Let's say we want to get the length of this string. Okay, so on the right-hand side, we know how to do it. If we have a non-null variable, we simply say cat name.length. Okay, so this will always return string length, since cat name is certainly not null because we haven't declared it as possibly null here. Okay, but on the left side, we have declared this variable as possibly null, and here we're trying to get the length. So we cannot just simply use the dot length here because that might lead to a crash. So instead, we're using the nullable operator. We're going to say cat name question mark dot length, and that will either return null if the cat name is null, or the actual string length. Okay, so if the variable is not null, then we'll get the length. If the variable is null, then we will get null. Okay, so let's try that out in code. We're going to say cat name. So we're going to declare a variable that can be null. Okay, so I've added the nullable operator here. And here, if we want to do dot length, that will give us a problem because it says only safe or non-null asserted. We're going to talk about this in another video in this section. Our calls are allowed on a nullable receiver of type string. Okay, so that simply means we have to use the question mark dot operator, and that will allow us to print out the length. So I'm just going to print line that out. Okay, and what I'm going to do next, I'm going to say cat name equals null. So I'm going to nullify that variable. And then I'm going to print line again that cat name question mark dot length. All right, there we go. So let's see what we get if we run this. So first we should get the actual length of the string as a first output. There we go. So we get 8 because our variable has a value. But here we have cat name null. So when we try to get the length of that null variable, we're going to get as a null result, right? So here we are printing out the null result. There we go. So that is how the null safe call operator works, the nullable operator. Now, safe calls can be chained for multiple operations. So if you want to do something extra to this length result, you can do it, but make sure that you know that this length can be null as well. So we can simply use the same operator to kind of chain operations together. Okay, so something like this, cat name.length $.toString if that's what we want. Okay, if we don't have a nullable value, we can simply chain them by dot. So here I'm going to say length $.toString. All right, and here I'm going to do the same $.toString. Okay, just so that we have an example of how this works. So here we should actually get the size of the string, and here we will get a null because this is null, therefore this is null as we've seen here, and therefore this will be null as well. All right, so let's run this again. There we go. So we get the length toString. This time it's a string. So before it was just a number, but this time it's toString. The output is exactly the same, so it doesn't really show in a different way here. But here we have catname.length.toString. Okay, so this will give us a null. This is null, this is null. So this is going to be null as well. And we're just printing out that null value. So just to kind of know that you can chain operations even if you have null values, but you need to use the $.operator. And the result can either be null or not null.